Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A new meal plan is being offered by the college. Read the plan in the college newspaper printed on page 60. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to two students who are talking about the plan.
I don't like to cook, but I don't like to eat in the cafeteria every day either.
True. The food does get kind of same old, same old.
My point exactly. And besides, I go home about every other weekend, so paying for my meals when I'm not there doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. So you'll probably sign up for the 5-day plan next semester.
I already did. If I want to eat in the cafeteria some weekend, I can just buy a meal. But I'd probably go out somewhere with my friends if I'm here over the weekend.
Well, I don't go home on the weekends as much as you do, but I still eat out a lot on the weekends.
So the 5-day plan might work out better for you, too. I'm really glad to have the option.
The man expresses his opinion of the new meal plan. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and listen to a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about Aboriginal people printed on page 61. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class. The professor is talking about Aboriginal people.
According to your textbook, the Aboriginal people are very diverse, and I would agree with that. However, there are certain beliefs that unite the groups and, in fact, allow them to identify themselves and others as members of the diverse Aboriginal societies. For one thing, unlike the anthropologists who believe that tribes arrived in eastern Australia from Tasmania about 40,000 years ago, the Aboriginal people believe that they have always been in Australia and that they have sprung from the land. Evidence for this resides in the oral history that has been recorded in stories and passed down for at least 50 generations. This history is referred to as the dreaming. The stories teach moral and spiritual values and provide each member of the group with an identity that reflects the landscape where the person's mother first becomes aware of the unborn baby, or, to put it in terms of the dreaming, where the spirit enters the mother's body. So, I am saying that the way that the Aboriginal people identify themselves and each other, even across groups, is by their membership in the oral history that they share.
Explain how the Aboriginal people are identified. Draw upon information in both the reading and the lecture.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and his friend.
So what time should we pick you up on Friday? Can you be ready by noon, or do you need another hour or so?
I really wanted to spend the weekend with my family, and the ride with you would have made it even more fun, but...
You mean you aren't going?
I can't. I'm not doing too well in my economics class, and I have a lecture Friday afternoon. I don't think I should miss it.
Well, why don't you borrow the notes from someone? Isn't your roommate in that class?
Yeah, he is, but I've already asked to borrow his notes once this semester. He didn't seem to mind, though.
Well, there you are. Unless you want to go to class on Thursday. I'm fairly sure that Dr. Collins teaches the same class Thursday night.
Really? She probably wouldn't mind if I sat in on the Thursday class, but I wonder if she'll give the same lecture. You know, maybe they're 1 week behind or 1 week ahead of us.
I suppose that's possible, but it would be easy enough to find out. You could just tell her that you'd like to attend the Thursday session this week because you need to go out of town. Then you can ride home with us. If there's a problem, you can still borrow your roommate's notes on Sunday when we get back.
Describe the man's problem and the 2 suggestions that his friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the man should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a talk. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a talk in a biology laboratory. The teaching assistant is explaining how to use the microscope.
All right, now that you all have microscopes at your tables, I want to explain how they work and how to use them. First of all, you should know that they are compound microscopes, so they can magnify objects up to 1,000 times their size. These microscopes have two systems, an illuminating system and an imaging system. You'll see that the illuminating system has a light source built in, and you can control it by adjusting the lever on the side. Why is this important? Well, the specimen must be pretty thin, or let's say transparent enough to let light pass through it. So the light source controls the amount of light that passes through the specimen. Okay, the other system provides magnification. Use this lever to switch powers. So when you switch to a higher power, you see a larger image. And when you switch to a lower power, you see a smaller image. But I should remind you that the field of view is smaller at a higher power. In other words, at a higher magnification, you see a larger image of a smaller area. Okay, so what about the focus? Well, these microscopes are parfocal, and that means you usually don't have to refocus when you switch to a higher or lower power of magnification. But there are two adjustment knobs, the larger one for coarse adjustment and the smaller one for fine adjustment, just in case.
Using the main points and examples from the talk, describe the two major systems of the laboratory microscope, and then explain how to use it.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 1, Writing Section.
First, read the passage on page 64 and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
So, what are the problems associated with the graded school system? Well, for one thing, graded schools don't take into account the differences in academic readiness on the part of individual learners. And by that, I mean that some 6-year-olds are simply not socially, mentally, or even physically mature enough to begin school. But others are ready in all those important ways by their 5th or even 4th birthdays. And by the time that girls and boys are in their early teens, we can see that there's a significant difference in maturity, in physical and social maturity, but they're still grouped together in intermediate grades in a graded school system. Okay. Besides the obvious differences in individual readiness and maturity, the whole issue of promotion needs to be reviewed. Grade level requirements don't really deal with the actual learning that has occurred in a positive way. Many research studies confirm that repeating an entire year because some of the material is not learned contributes to boredom, poor self-concept, and eventually to higher dropout rates. And since graded schools are using group expectations as measured by performance on standardized tests, this is another way to evaluate the group rather than the individual. So what happens is that individual differences in how long it takes to learn a concept or the partial achievement of a grade level curriculum that is never addressed by the graded school system. Students who need more time to learn have to repeat material that they already know. Students who can learn at a faster rate have to wait for the new material to be presented. So, as you can see, it's not ideal.
Model Test 1. Example answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1. Marriage partner.
In my view, 3 characteristics are essential for a marriage partner. Compatibility is very important because spending the rest of your life with someone's a huge commitment, and without compatibility in values and interests and goals, it could be a struggle rather than a partnership. I also think that a good marriage partner should fit into your family. Without acceptance and affection for you as a couple, you could risk the relationships you have with family members. And attraction is another factor. Since fidelity is part of the marriage contract, the expression of love will be limited to your partner, so it should be a person you're attracted to.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2. News.
Although newspapers contain some information that's limited to local interests, and I like to turn to those pages, for the most part, I prefer to get my news on TV and on my computer. The problem with printed news is it takes so long to produce it that the stories could have changed, or more important news could have happened minutes after the newspaper is delivered. So, I scan the local stories in the paper when I get home from work. Then I watch the international news on TV at night for the most current information. And the following morning, I click on one of the websites that offer the most recent updates of the lead stories. That way, I'm taking advantage of the best aspects of all the news media. And I stay current, locally and internationally.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3. Meal plan.
The man's glad that an alternative to the 7-day meal plan is now available for students who live in the dorms. He'll purchase the 5-day meal plan, which provides 3 meals on weekdays and the option to buy meals on the weekends for $3 each. The new 5-day meal plan's better for him because he likes to go home every other weekend, and when he's on campus, he likes to go out with his friends. So he wasn't taking advantage of the cafeteria on the weekends even though he was paying for it. The student union has fast food as well as booths in the food court for Chinese or Mexican food or even a salad bar. Besides, if he wants to eat in the cafeteria on a weekend, he can buy a meal. He should save about $48 a month by using the new plan, and he can use that money to eat out.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Aboriginal people.
The Aboriginal people are culturally and linguistically diverse, in part because the geography dictated both limitations and opportunities for their communities. So the establishment of identity as a member of the Aboriginal people because of appearance, language, culture, or geographical location isn't considered accurate. The Department of Education suggests that the best means of identification is to be recognized and accepted by other members of the Aboriginal society. According to the lecturer, even diverse groups have certain unifying beliefs that are passed down as oral tradition, called the dreaming. The stories associated with this tradition are used to teach ethical principles and spiritual lessons. It'd probably be through knowledge of this shared oral history that Aborigines would identify each other.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Scheduling conflict.
The man had liked to visit his family over the weekend, but his friends are leaving before his economics class on Friday. He doesn't want to miss the class because he needs to bring his grade up. His friend suggests that he borrow the notes from the class. His roommate didn't have a problem lending him notes from that class earlier in the semester, but he's reluctant to do that. The other possibility that his friend mentions is for him to attend another section of the same class on Thursday night, but he isn't sure that the professor will give him the same lecture. To find out, he'd have to ask the professor. In my opinion, the man should stay for his economics class and take notes. It's hard to read someone else's notes, and besides, if he's in the class, he can ask questions. If he wants to visit his family, he should try to find a ride on Saturday or on Friday after the class.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 6. Laboratory microscope.
The two major systems of the laboratory microscope are the illuminating system and the imaging system. The illuminating system has a light source that can be controlled to let more or less light pass through the specimen you're viewing when you move a lever on the side of the microscope. The imaging system's actually a magnification feature, which can be calibrated by using the other lever to change powers. When you look through a higher power, the image appears to be larger, and conversely, when you look through a lower power, it appears to be smaller. What that really means is when you use a higher magnification, the image actually shows you a smaller part of the specimen because it's enlarged. Now, when you switch powers, the lenses will focus automatically, but the big knob will allow you to make a rough adjustment, and the small knob will let you make a more detailed adjustment, if you want.
Practice activities from Chapter 3.
Activity 2. Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
1. Listen to part of a lecture in a business class.
2. Listen to part of a lecture in a music appreciation class.
3. Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
4. Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
5. Listen to part of a lecture in an engineering class.
6. Listen to part of a lecture in a linguistics class.
7. Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
8. Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
9. Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class.
10. Listen to part of a lecture in a history class. Activity 3. 1.
I have several slides of mosaic art, mostly from the 5th century.
2.
Right. So last time we were discussing multinational companies. Today we're going to look at global companies.
3.
Well, today's lecture is about light years.
4.
So if you read the chapter in your textbook, the one about insurance, then you have some background for today's lecture.
5.
Although Malthus's theory of population is still important, I'm going to share a different approach with you today called demographic transition.
6.
Okay then, let's begin our discussion of marshland habitats.
Seven.
Sorry about the mix-up with our classroom on the schedule. I'm glad you found us. So, this will be the room we'll be using for the rest of the semester. Okay then, let's get on with our discussion of igneous rocks.
Eight.
From your syllabus, you'll know that today we're talking about adobe construction, specifically how it can be adapted to modern architecture.
9.
Let's ask ourselves this simple question. How does an antibiotic make you well?
10.
All right, we've been talking about reptiles. Now let's turn our attention to amphibians.
Activity 7. Listen to the beginning of a lecture in a linguistics class.
Good morning. Well, we have a lot to do today, so let's get going. If you're caught up with your reading assignments, you've already read the article on the 3 types of language. But before we go on with the discussion, I want to take a few minutes to compare them. Okay, standard language first. That's language that's comprehended, used, and considered acceptable by most speakers. I mean, native speakers. So definitions of words and phrases in standard language, they're found in the dictionary. They can be used in both formal and informal situations, settings, and this is important. Standard language is appropriate in both speech and writing. I'd say that all of these characteristics combine to make standard language. Well, let's just say that it's the permanent core of a language. That brings us to colloquial language, which is included in dictionaries, but colloquial language is marked, and usually it's a colloquial idiom. So these patterns of colloquial language are understood and used and accepted in informal exchanges. And people use them in informal situations, but they're not really considered appropriate in formal settings. Did I say that colloquial language is more prevalent in speech than in writing? That's important. And the key point in the article was that colloquial language becomes so much part of the culture that at some point it often evolves into standard language. So you can compare an earlier dictionary with a recent dictionary, and you can see how some phrases that are marked as colloquial language lose that designation in later editions of the same dictionary. Okay. So you can see that colloquial idioms last a long time, either remaining popular in colloquial speech, or, as I said, it can evolve into standard language and become a permanent part of the language. But that's very different from slang expressions because, and this is the key point, slang is usually a temporary phenomenon. It's used by some speakers or groups in informal situations, and they're much more common in speech than they are in writing. Sometimes they're included in a dictionary, but they're always clearly marked as slang. And when you check later editions of the dictionary, quite often the slang expression is no longer included because it's out of style. Now, let's consider the 3 types of language together, and I want you to think of them on a continuum from most to least formal. So, if we do that, colloquial language would have to go between standard and slang. So the slang is often relegated to a temporary fad, and standard language contains the stable elements of the language, and colloquial language has the potential to become a permanent part of the language. But it might not. I think it's interesting that most native speakers will use all 3 types of language, and they'll use them all appropriately without thinking about it. In fact, only a few speakers will be able to analyze their speech and writing using the labels that the author identified in the article. That said, let's get out the article for today's discussion and...
Activity 8. Listen to the beginning of a lecture in a sociology class as you read the transcript. The professor is discussing status and roles.
Status refers to a position in society or in a group. But there are really two types of status: ascribed status and achieved status. Okay? In ascribed status, the status is automatic, so you don't have a choice. In other words, it's an involuntary status. And some examples that come to mind are status because of race or sex. Not much you can do about that. On the other hand, achieved status requires some effort and there's a choice involved. For instance, a marriage partner or the type of education or, for that matter, the length of time in school. Well, these are choices, achievements, and so they fall under the category of achieved status. So that brings us to the status set. A status set is the combination of all statuses that an individual has. Me, for example, I'm a professor, but I'm also a husband and a father and a son since my mother's still living. So in each of these statuses, I have certain behaviors that are expected because of the status. Okay, all of the behaviors are roles. I mean, a role is the behavior expected because of status. Okay, back to status set. All of the statuses, husband, father, son, professor, combine to form the status set, and each of the statuses have certain expectations. Let me use that professor status again. So, as a professor, I have a teaching role, and I have to prepare classes. That's expected. I also advise students, grade assignments, and evaluate my students. But this role has very different expectations. As a researcher, I have to design studies, raise funds for grants, and then perform the research. And finally, I write articles and reports. So I think you see what I mean. But one more thing, and this is important. Sometimes role conflict can occur. Let me say that again. Role conflict. And that means that meeting the expectations for one role will cause problems for an individual who's trying to meet other expectations in a different role. Okay, let's say that one of my students is dating my daughter. I don't recommend this. But anyway, I may have role strain that could even develop into role conflict because it will be difficult for me to meet the expectations for my role as teacher. And when the student comes to my house, I'll have to remember my status as father and my role that requires me to welcome a guest into my home. And, well, form an opinion about someone who wants to take my daughter out on a date. The textbook actually has...
Activity 9. Listen to some sentences from college lectures. Take notes as quickly as you can. 1.
The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave women the right to vote, beginning with the elections of 1920.
2.
In a suspension bridge, there are two towers with one or more flexible cables firmly attached at each end.
3.
A perennial is any plant that continues to grow for more than 2 years, as for example trees and shrubs.
4.
Famous for innovations in punctuation, typography, and language, Edward Estlin Cummings, known to us as E. E. Cummings, published his collected poems in 1954.
5.
Absolute zero, the temperature at which all substances have zero thermal energy, and thus the lowest possible temperatures, is unattainable in practice.
6.
Because Columbus, Ohio is considered a typical metropolitan area, it's often used for market research to test new products.
7.
The cacao bean was cultivated by the Aztecs. not only to drink, but also as currency in their society.
Eight.
The blue whale is the largest known animal, reaching a length of more than 100 feet, which is 5 times its size at birth.
9.
Ontario is the heartland of Canada, both geographically and I would say historically as well.
10.
Nuclear particles, called hadrons, which include the proton and neutron, are made from quarks, very odd particles that have a slight electrical charge, but that cannot exist alone in nature.
Activity 10. Listen to some sentences from college lectures. Take notes by drawing diagrams. 1.
A filament is the stalk of a stamen.
2.
There are 3 factors that determine whether a credit applicant's a good risk: character, capacity, and capital.
3.
In photosynthesis, the chloroplasts in the leaf absorb energy from the sun and then convert carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water into carbohydrates.
4.
It was in the Cenozoic era that Homo sapiens first appeared, which was only about 1.8 million years ago, long after the Mesozoic era, perhaps 200 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth, and even earlier, approximately 540 million years ago, well, that was the Paleozoic era, when there was an explosive evolution of marine life.
5.
In the sense that it's used among sociologists, the overwhelming feeling or need to escape a situation immediately is known as panic.
6.
The difference between slate and phyllite is the coarseness of the grain and the color, slate being much more fine, often gray and easily split along the cleavage, whereas phyllite tends to be more coarsely grained, rather lustrous in appearance and feel, and oh yes, it can be gray, green, or even red.
7.
Regulatory genes, called homeotic genes, cause the body parts of animals to develop appropriately.
8.
There were 2 types of decorations on
Activity 12. 1.
Because light travels faster than sound, lightning appears to go before thunder.
Two.
Congress looked up to Jefferson because of his intelligence and creativity.
3.
The lower teeth in crocodiles stick out when their mouths are closed.
4.
Some sponges look like plants.
5.
The first census was carried out in Great Britain in 1801.
6.
People who have gone through a traumatic event may have recurring images of it.
7.
In algebra, letters and other symbols stand for numbers.
8.
During periods of stress or excitement, the heart rate goes up and airways to the lungs become dilated.
9.
Theories of prehistory and early humans are constantly changing as we take into account the new evidence from archaeological finds.
10.
Dreams may have been the inspiration for the surrealists to come up with their works of art.
Activity 13. Adjectives.
1. The temperature in many desert regions is not hot at night.
2. Facial expressions may not be unique across cultures.
3. Obsidian is not dull because it cools too quickly for crystals to form.
4. Not many musical instruments play louder than 100 decibels or softer than 20 decibels.
5. The people who have adapted to life at very high altitudes are usually not tall.
Nouns.
1. In many cities, people who are trying to sell their goods must have a license to set up their booths in public areas.
2. Studies show that small animals that live indoors are a positive influence in elderly people's lives.
3. Staircases were an important feature of the palaces where the aristocracy lived, constructed during the Baroque period.
4. Global wind patterns are affected by the way that the Earth turns.
5. Education that includes 2 languages is more common in regions where language minorities live.
Verbs.
1. Unlike cast iron, pure wrought iron has no carbon.
2. Hypnosis causes a heightened state of suggestibility in a willing participant.
3. Productivity increases when fewer employees are required to do the work.
4. Normally, the plasma in human blood is 50 to 60% of the total blood volume.
5. 3/4 of the goods made in Canada for export are sold to the United States.
Activity 18. 1.
According to a study by Professor Carter, and I quote, patients can lower their blood pressure by losing weight and decreasing their intake of salt, end quote.
2.
According to Professor Jones, and I'm quoting here, over 14 billion euros were introduced into the world economy in January 2002, end quote.
3.
To quote a study in the Journal of Psychology, many people who have achieved their career ambitions by midlife are afflicted by depression, end quote.
4.
According to the textbook, and I'm quoting here, an organ is a group of tissues capable of performing some special function, end quote.
5.
According to Professor Stevens, and I quote, John Philip Sousa was the greatest composer of marches for bands, end quote.
6.
In Professor Davison's opinion, and I quote, Ben Jonson may be the author of several plays attributed to William Shakespeare, end quote.
7.
Professor Davis said that, and I'm quoting here, statistical data can be very difficult to interpret because correlations are not causes, end quote.
8.
As Professor Gray puts it, and I quote, the Prime Minister serves at the pleasure of the Parliament, end quote.
9.
According to the reading passage, and I quote, moving water is the single most important factor in determining the surface features of the Earth, end quote.
10.
In Professor Russell's opinion, and I am quoting here, the most important quality for a scientist is the ability to make careful observations, end quote.
Activity 20. 1.
In his book, The Making of the President, Theodore White noted that the 1960 presidential debate was more like a press conference. According to White, Nixon proceeded as though he were engaged in a personal debate. In contrast, Kennedy spoke directly to the TV viewers. He estimated that Kennedy gained 2 million votes as a result.
2.
Paul Cézanne believed that all forms in nature were based on geometric shapes. Cézanne identified the cone, sphere, and cylinder as the primary forms. He used outlining to emphasize these shapes.
3.
Along with her husband, Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1903 for the discovery of radium. Curie then received the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1911 for the isolation of pure radium. She was the first person to be awarded 2 Nobel Prizes.
4.
Psychologist Erik Erikson proposed 8 stages of personal development. Erikson claimed that psychological crises at each stage shaped the sense of self. He believed that development was a lifelong process.
5.
Margaret Mead did her first fieldwork in Samoa in 1925. Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa, was a bestseller that was translated into many languages. She's still one of the most well-known anthropologists in the world. Mead believed that people in simple societies could provide valuable lessons for the industrialized world.
6.
Leonardo da Vinci was the quintessential Renaissance man, a brilliant painter. Da Vinci was perhaps best remembered for his art. But he was also interested in mechanics, and his understanding of mathematics is clear in his use of perspective.
Seven.
Author Peter Drucker wrote Management Challenges for the 21st Century. In this book, Drucker proposed 5 transforming forces. He predicted that these trends will have major implications for the long-term strategies of companies.
8.
Friedrich Mohs devised a scale of hardness for 10 minerals. By assigning 10 to diamond, the hardest known mineral, Mohs was able to attribute relative values to all the other minerals. His scale is still useful in the study of minerals today.
9.
Maria Montessori proposed an educational model that has become known as the Montessori method. Montessori insisted that education should not be merely the transmission of knowledge, but the freedom to develop as a person. She felt her greatest success was achieved when a child began working independently.
10.
In collaboration with Louis Leakey, Jane Goodall spent years living with chimpanzees on the Gombe Reserve. Goodall imitated their behaviors and discovered that chimpanzees lived within a complex social organization. She was the first to document chimpanzees making and using tools, and she also identified 20 different sounds that were part of a communication system.
Activity 21. Listen to part of a lecture in a botany class.
The acacia is a genus of trees and shrubs of the mimosa family that originated in Australia and has long been used in building simple mud and stick structures there. The acacia is called a wattle in Australia, and the structures are made of wattle stuck together with daub, which is a kind of mud adobe. Now this is interesting. The acacia is related to the family of plants known as legumes, and I'm sure you remember that legumes include peas, beans, lentils, peanuts, and pods with bean-like seeds. Some acacias actually produce edible crops, but other acacia varieties are valued for the sticky resin called gum arabic or gum acacia, and that is used widely in medicines, foods, and perfumes. A few varieties are grown for the dark, dense wood, which is just excellent for making pianos, or for the bark that is very rich in tannin, a dark, acidic substance used to cure the hides of animals to make leather. Let's see. Nearly 500 species of acacia have been identified and categorized and proven capable of survival in hot and generally arid parts of the world. But only a dozen of the 300 Australian varieties seem to thrive in the southern United States. Most acacia imports are low, spreading trees, but of these only 3 flower. The Bailey acacia has fern-like silver leaves and small, fragrant flowers arranged in sort of rounded clusters. The silver wattle's similar to the Bailey acacia, but it grows about twice as high. And the Sydney golden wattle is bushy with broad, flat leaves, and it's the golden wattle with the showy, bright yellow blossoms. Okay, the black acacia is also called the blackwood. It has dark green foliage, and the blossoms are rather ordinary, but besides being a popular ornamental tree, the black acacia is considered valuable for its dark wood, which is used in making furniture and musical instruments. I think I mentioned that acacias are used to make pianos. Well, a piano made of black acacia is highly prized in the musical world. Now, some of you may have heard that the acacia's unique custom of blossoming in February in the United States has something to do with its Australian origins. But that just isn't so. It isn't the date. It's the quality of light that makes the difference for the flowering cycle of a tree. As you know, in the southern hemisphere, the seasons are reversed, and February, which is wintertime in the United States, is summertime in Australia. Actually, however, the pale yellow blossoms appear in August in Australia. So, whether it grows in the northern or the southern hemisphere, The acacia blossoms in winter.
Activity 23. Listen to part of a lecture in a chemistry class.
Although the purpose and techniques were often magical, alchemy was, in many ways, the predecessor of the modern science of chemistry. The fundamental premise of alchemy derived from the best philosophical dogma and scientific practice of the time, and the majority of educated persons between 1400 and 1600 believed that alchemy had great merit. The earliest authentic works on European alchemy are those of the English monk Roger Bacon and the German philosopher St. Albertus Magnus. In their treatises, they maintained that gold was the perfect metal, and that inferior metals such as lead and mercury were removed by various degrees of imperfection from gold. They further asserted that these base metals could be transmuted to gold by blending them with a substance more perfect than gold. This elusive substance was referred to as the philosopher's stone. The process was called transmutation. Most of the early alchemists were artisans who were accustomed to keeping trade secrets and often resorted to cryptic terminology to record the progress of their work. The term sun was used for gold, moon for silver, and the 5 known planets for the base metals. This convention of substituting symbolic language attracted some mystical philosophers who compared the search for the perfect metal with the struggle of humankind for the perfection of the soul. The philosophers began to use the artisans' terms in the mystical literature that they produced. Thus, by the 14th century, alchemy had developed 2 distinct groups of practitioners, the laboratory alchemist and the literary alchemist. Both groups of alchemists continued to work throughout the history of alchemy, but of course, it was the literary alchemist who was more likely to produce a written record. Therefore, much of what is known about the science of alchemy is derived from philosophers rather than from the alchemists who labored in laboratories. Despite centuries of experimentation, laboratory alchemists failed to produce gold from other materials. However, they gained wide knowledge of chemical substances, discovered chemical properties, and invented many of the tools and techniques that are used by chemists today. Many laboratory chemists earnestly devoted themselves to the scientific discovery of new compounds and reactions, and therefore must be considered the legitimate forefathers of modern chemistry. They continued to call themselves alchemists, but they were becoming true chemists.
Activity 24. Listen to part of a lecture in an English class.
Few have influenced the development of American English to the extent that Noah Webster did. After a short career in law, he turned to teaching, but he discovered how inadequate the available school books were for the children of a new and independent nation. In response to the need for truly American textbooks, Webster published A Grammatical Institute of the English Language, a 3-volume work that consisted of a speller, a grammar, and a reader. The first volume, which was generally known as the American Spelling Book, was so popular that eventually it sold more than 80 million copies and provided him with a considerable income for the rest of his life. Can you imagine that? Anyway, in 1807, Noah Webster began his greatest work, An American Dictionary of the English Language. In preparing the manuscript, he devoted 10 years to the study of English and its relationship to other languages, and 7 more years to the writing itself. Published in 2 volumes in 1828, An American Dictionary of the English Language has become the recognized authority for usage in the United States. Webster's purpose in writing it was to demonstrate that the American language was developing distinct meanings, pronunciations, and spellings from those of British English. He's responsible for advancing many of the simplified spelling forms that distinguish American English from British. Webster was the first author to gain copyright protection in the United States by being awarded a copyright for the American Spelling Book, and he continued to lobby over the next 50 years for the protection of intellectual properties, that is, for authors' rights. By the time that Webster brought out the second edition of his dictionary, which included 70,000 entries instead of the original 38,000, the name Webster had become synonymous with American dictionaries. It was this second edition that served as the basis for the many revisions that have been produced by others, ironically, under the uncopyrighted Webster name.
Activity 25. Listen to part of a lecture in an engineering class.
The question has often been posed, why were the Wright brothers able to succeed in an effort at which so many others had failed? Well, many explanations have been mentioned, but 3 reasons are most often cited, and I tend to agree with them. First, the Wright brothers were a team. Both men worked congenially and cooperatively, read the same books, located and shared information, talked incessantly about the possibility of manned flight, and served as constant sources of inspiration and encouragement to each other. So, to put it quite simply, 2 geniuses are better than 1 genius. Second, both the brothers were glider pilots, so unlike some other engineers who experimented with the theories of flight, Orville and Wilbur Wright experienced the practical aspects of aerodynamics by building and flying gliders. And this may surprise you, they even flew in kites. Now, each craft they built was slightly superior to the last because they incorporated the knowledge that they had gained from previous failures to adjust the next design. They had realized fairly early on from their experiments that the most serious challenge in manned flight would be stabilizing and maneuvering the aircraft once it was airborne. So, while others concentrated their efforts on the problem of achieving lift for takeoff, the Wright brothers were focusing on developing a 3-axis control for guiding their aircraft. By the time that the brothers started to build an airplane, they were already among the world's best glider pilots, and they knew about the problems of riding the air firsthand. In addition, the Wright brothers had designed more effective wings for their airplane than anyone else had been able to engineer. Using a wind tunnel, they tested more than 200 different wing designs, recording the effects of slight variations in shape on the pressure of air on the wings. The data from these experiments allowed the Wright brothers to construct a superior wing for their aircraft. But, in spite of these advantages, the Wright brothers still might not have succeeded if they hadn't been born at precisely the right time in history. Attempts to achieve manned flight in the early 19th century were doomed because the steam engines that powered the aircrafts were just too heavy in proportion to the power that they produced. But by the end of the 19th century, when the brothers were experimenting with engineering options, a relatively light internal combustion engine had already been invented, and they were able to bring the ratio of weight to power within acceptable limits for flight.
Activity 26. Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
The protozoans, minute aquatic creatures, each of which consists of a single cell of protoplasm, constitute a classification of the most primitive forms of animal life. The very name protozoan indicates the scientific understanding of the animals. Proto means first or primitive, and zoa refers to the animal. They are fantastically diverse, but 3 major groups may be identified on the basis of their motility. The Mastigophora have 1 or more long tails that they use to propel themselves forward. The Ciliata, which use the same basic means for locomotion as the Mastigophora, have a larger number of short tails. The Sarcodina, which include amoebae, float or row themselves about on their crusted bodies. In addition to their form of movement, several other features discriminate among the 3 groups of protozoans. For example, at least 2 nuclei per cell have been identified in the Ciliata, usually a large nucleus that regulates growth but decomposes during reproduction, and a smaller one that contains the genetic code necessary to generate the large nucleus. So, all of this seems very straightforward to this point, but now we're going to complicate the picture. Chlorophyll, which is the green substance in plants, is also found in the bodies of some protozoans, enabling them to make at least some of their own food from water and carbon dioxide. Sounds like photosynthesis, doesn't it? But protozoans are animals, right? And plants are the life forms that use photosynthesis. Okay, well, protozoans are not considered plants because, unlike pigmented plants to which some protozoans are otherwise almost identical, they don't live on simple organic compounds. Their cells demonstrate all of the major characteristics of the cells of higher animals, such as eating, breathing, and reproducing. Now, many species of protozoans collect into colonies, physically connected to one another, and responding uniformly to outside stimuli. Current research into this phenomenon, along with investigations carried out with advanced microscopes, may necessitate a redefinition of what constitutes protozoans, even calling into question the basic premise that they have only one cell. Nevertheless, with the current data available, almost 40,000 species of protozoans have been identified. No doubt as technology improves methods of observation, better models of classification of these simple single cells will be proposed.
Activity 27. Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
The development of the horse has been recorded from the beginning through all of its evolutionary stages to the modern form. It is perhaps one of the most complete and well-documented chapters of paleontological history. Fossil finds provide us not only with detailed information about the horse itself, but also with valuable insights into the migration of herds and even evidence for the speculation about the climatic conditions that could have instigated their migratory behavior. Now, geologists believe that the first horses appeared on Earth about 60 million years ago, as compared with only 2 million years ago for the appearance of human beings. There's evidence of early horses on both the American and European continents. But it's been documented that almost 12 million years ago, at the beginning of the Pliocene age, a horse about midway through its evolutionary development crossed a land bridge where the Bering Strait's now located. It traveled from Alaska into the grasslands of Asia and all the way to Europe. So this early horse was a hipparion, about the size of a modern-day pony, with 3 toes and specialized cheek teeth for grazing. In Europe, the hipparion encountered another less advanced horse called the Anchitheres, which had previously invaded Europe by the same route, probably during the Miocene period. Less developed and smaller than the hipparion, the Anchitheres was eventually completely replaced by it. By the end of the Pleistocene age, both the Anchitheres and the hipparion had become extinct in North America, where they originated, as fossil evidence clearly demonstrates. In Europe, they evolved into the larger and stronger animal that's very similar to the horse as we know it today. For many years, this horse was probably hunted for food by early tribes of human beings. Then the qualities of the horse that would have made it a good servant were recognized, mainly its strength and speed. It was time for the horse to be tamed, used as a draft animal at the dawning of agriculture, and then ridden as need for transportation increased. It was the descendant of this domesticated horse that was brought back across the ocean to the Americas by European colonists.
Activity 28. Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
Okay, then, let's talk about human memory, which was formerly believed to be rather inefficient as compared with, for example, computers. But we're finding that we probably have a much more sophisticated mechanism than we'd originally assumed. Researchers approaching the problem from a variety of points of view have all concluded that there's a great deal more stored in our minds than has been generally supposed. Here's what I mean. Dr. Wilder Penfield, a Canadian neurosurgeon, proved that by stimulating their brains electrically, he could elicit the total recall of complex events in his subjects' lives. Even dreams and other minor events supposedly forgotten for many years suddenly emerged in detail. The memory trace is the term for whatever forms the internal representation of the specific information about an event stored in the memory. So the trace is probably made by structural changes in the brain. But the problem is that the memory trace isn't really subject to direct observation because it's more a theoretical construct that we use to speculate about how information presented at a particular time can cause performance at a later time. So most theories include the strength of the memory trace as a variable in the degree of learning, retention, and retrieval possible for a memory. One theory is that the fantastic capacity for storage in the brain is the result of an almost unlimited combination of interconnections between brain cells stimulated by patterns of activity. And repeated references to the same information supports recall. Or to say that another way, improved performance is the result of strengthening the chemical bonds in the memory. Now here's the interesting part. Psychologists generally divide memory into at least two types, short-term memory and long-term memory, which combine to form what we call working memory. Short-term memory contains what we're actively focusing on at any particular time, but items aren't retained longer than 20 or 30 seconds without verbal rehearsal. We use short-term memory when we look up a telephone number and repeat it to ourselves until we can place the call. In contrast, long-term memory can store facts, concepts, and experiences after we stop thinking about them. All conscious processing of information, as in problem solving, for example, involves both short-term and long-term memory. As we repeat, rehearse, and recycle information, the memory trace is strengthened, allowing that information to move from short-term memory to long-term memory.